Imagine standing in a field in the English countryside, surrounded by the rolling hills of Salisbury Plain. You're at Stonehenge, a monument so famous that millions visit each year, their cameras clicking at the ancient stone circle that has stood for over 4,000 years. But what if I told you that Stonehenge is merely the tourist attraction, the visible tip of an archaeological iceberg that conceals something far more mysterious beneath the surface? Just 2 miles from those iconic standing stones lies a discovery so recent, and so baffling that it has rewritten everything we thought we knew about Neolithic Britain. In 2020, archaeologists detected a ring of massive shafts encircling the ancient settlement of Durrington walls. These aren't small holes. Each shaft measures over 30 feet across and 30 feet deep, forming a perfect circle more than a mile in diameter. 20 of them, positioned with astronomical precision, excavated by people who supposedly possessed only antlers and wooden tools. The largest prehistoric structure ever discovered in Britain. Built 5,000 years ago by a civilization we barely understand. And here's what terrifies researchers: we have absolutely no idea why they built it, how they achieved such precision, or what purpose these enormous pits served. We are taught that our Neolithic ancestors were simple farmers, communities of Stone-Age people who had just discovered agriculture and were taking their first tentative steps towards civilization. The textbooks show us primitive settlements, people living in basic huts, their lives consumed by the daily struggle for survival. But across Britain, across Europe, and across the world, we find evidence that shatters this patronizing narrative. Massive earthworks requiring millions of hours of coordinated labor. Astronomical alignments demonstrating mathematical and observational knowledge that would not be formally documented for thousands of years. Social organization on a scale that demands sophisticated planning, resource management, and shared purpose. These were not simple people living simple lives. They were capable of achievements that challenge our understanding of human development. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Stonehenge landscape, where a discovery made just 5 years ago has forced archaeologists to completely reconsider what Neolithic Britain was truly capable of achieving. The Stonehenge landscape sits on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, a region of gently rolling chalk hills that stretch endlessly under vast skies. For centuries, Stonehenge itself dominated our attention, its massive sarsen stones and smaller bluestones arranged in that iconic circular pattern that has become synonymous with ancient mystery. Tourists arrive by the busload, walking the carefully maintained paths around the monument, kept at a respectful distance from the stones themselves. The site feels manageable, contained, almost comfortable in its familiarity. We have studied it for so long that we feel we understand it, even if questions remain. But venture just 2 miles northeast from Stonehenge, following the gentle slope of the land down toward the River Avon, and you arrive at a far less famous site called Durrington Walls. Here, massive earthen banks form a huge circular enclosure, so large that an entire village now sits within its boundaries. Sheep graze on the embankments. Farmers plow the fields inside. For years, archaeologists knew this as the location of a major Neolithic settlement, possibly the village where the builders of Stonehenge lived. They had excavated house foundations, found pottery and tools, analyzed the remains of feasts. It seemed like a significant but understood site. Then, in 2020, everything changed. A team of researchers from the University of Bradford, St. Andrews, and Warwick, working with the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, deployed remote sensing technology across the landscape surrounding Durrington Walls. They were using ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic induction sensors, looking for buried archaeological features that might have escaped detection. The data that came back made no sense at first. The instruments were detecting massive anomalies in the earth, huge disturbances arranged in what appeared to be a precise geometric pattern. The researchers ran the scans again, thinking the equipment had malfunctioned. The results were identical. What they had found was a ring of enormous shafts, each one a prehistoric pit measuring over 10 meters in diameter and over 10 meters deep. 20 of these shafts formed a circle approximately 2 kilometers in diameter, perfectly centered on Durrington Walls itself. This was not a few random pits. This was deliberate, planned, executed with precision. The team began excavation on several of the shafts to confirm what the sensors suggested. What they found underground was both confirmation and deepening mystery. Each shaft descended more than 30 feet into the solid chalk bedrock of Salisbury Plain. To understand the scale of what this means, picture an excavation roughly the size of a large room, going down 3 stories into solid rock. Now multiply that by 20. The total volume of material removed from these shafts exceeds 17,000 cubic meters. That's enough to fill nearly 7 Olympic-sized swimming pools with solid chalk. But volume is only part of the impossibility. The shafts were excavated around 2500 BC, during the late Neolithic period. The people who dug them had no metal tools. The Bronze Age had not yet begun in Britain. Their primary digging implements, based on archaeological evidence from similar sites, would have been red deer antlers, used as picks to break up the chalk, along with the shoulder blades of cattle used as shovels. These are organic tools, relatively soft compared to the chalk they were cutting through. Modern experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate Neolithic digging techniques, and researchers have found that even with the most efficient methods, excavating chalk with antler picks proceeds at a pace of approximately 1 cubic meter per person per week. Given the total volume of the Durrington shafts, this means we're looking at roughly 17,000 person-weeks of labor. That translates to more than 325 years of continuous work for a single person, or if spread across a community of 100 workers, approximately 3.5 years of full-time excavation. But the labor requirements, staggering as they are, pale beside the precision problem. The shafts are not randomly scattered across the landscape. They form a nearly perfect circle with a diameter of 2 kilometers, positioned with tolerances that suggest sophisticated surveying capabilities. Dr. Vincent Gaffney, the lead archaeologist on the Discovery team, noted in the initial report published in the journal Internet Archaeology that the alignment of the shafts demonstrates an unprecedented level of surveying and spatial planning for a Neolithic monument. To achieve this precision without modern surveying equipment requires establishing a central reference point at Durrington walls, then measuring outward in multiple directions while maintaining consistent distance. The margin of error across the 2-kilometer diameter is remarkably small, suggesting the use of standardized measuring techniques and careful coordination across the entire construction team. Consider what this demands: multiple work crews, separated by distances up to 1 kilometer from each other, all excavating to the same depth and diameter specifications, all positioned to create a unified geometric pattern that would have been impossible to verify from ground level. There's no high vantage point on Salisbury Plain from which to observe the overall pattern. The layout could only be confirmed through careful measurement and maintained reference points. Even more puzzling, radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the bottom of excavated shafts confirms they were all dug during a relatively brief period, probably within a span of a few decades rather than centuries. This means the construction was not some gradual, generational project. It was a concentrated effort, requiring the mobilization of large labor forces, the organization of work crews, the provision of food and resources for workers, and the coordination of a master plan that existed in someone's mind or in some form of plan that has not survived. We have no written records from Neolithic Britain. No blueprints, no architect's drawings, no administrative documents detailing work assignments or resource allocation. Yet somehow, a society we classify as prehistoric accomplished an engineering project that would challenge modern construction companies. And here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night: we have found no evidence of the tools that would have been required. No large accumulations of broken antler picks. No worn cattle scapulae bearing the marks of heavy use. No staging areas where tools were manufactured or maintained. It's as if the shafts were excavated, and then every trace of the construction process vanished. What do you think? How could a supposedly primitive society, working with only organic tools, coordinate the excavation of 20 massive shafts arranged in a geometrically precise circle over 2 kilometers in diameter? Does this suggest a level of social organization and technical capability that we've dramatically underestimated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. According to the initial reports published by the Discovery team, The Durrington shafts date to approximately 2500 BC, placing them in the late Neolithic period, contemporary with the final phases of Stonehenge's construction. This dating comes from radiocarbon analysis of charcoal and animal bones found at the bottom of several excavated shafts. The dates cluster around 4,500 years ago, which aligns neatly with what we know about intensive activity in the Stonehenge landscape during this period. Durrington Walls itself was occupied during this time, with evidence of large-scale feasting and communal gatherings. The timeline appears straightforward. However, several complications emerge when we examine the evidence more carefully. First, radiocarbon dating can only tell us when organic material was deposited in the shafts, not when the shafts themselves were excavated. If the pits were dug and then remained open for years or even decades before material accumulated at the bottom, the radiocarbon dates would reflect the filling events, not the original construction. Second, only a handful of the 20 shafts have been excavated and dated. The others remain underground, detected only by remote sensing. We cannot assume that all 20 were excavated simultaneously without testing each one individually. More troubling are the geological questions raised by Dr. Timothy Darville of Bournemouth University, who has studied the Stonehenge landscape for over 30 years. He points out that the shafts show varying degrees of erosion and infilling, suggesting they may not all be the same age. Some appear to have remained open longer than others, their sides collapsing inward over time, while others seem to have been deliberately backfilled soon after excavation. This variation is difficult to explain if all 20 shafts were part of a single, coordinated construction project. Additionally, there's the matter of the landscape itself. The chalk downland of Salisbury Plain has been continuously modified by human activity for 5,000 years. Bronze Age burial mounds dot the area. Iron Age hill forts occupy prominent positions. Roman roads cut across the terrain. Medieval field systems altered the topography. Modern agriculture has plowed and replowed the soil for centuries. Any surface features associated with the Durrington shafts have long since been erased, leaving us only with what survives underground. This means we're trying to understand a monument that we can barely see, whose full extent remains unknown. The stratigraphic evidence, the layers of soil and deposits within the shafts, adds further confusion. Some shafts contain evidence of rapid infilling, as if they were deliberately filled soon after excavation. Others show slow, gradual accumulation of material over centuries, suggesting they remained open as features in the landscape for generations. Why would some be filled immediately while others were left open? Were they serving different functions? Did the purpose of the monument change over time? And most intriguingly, several of the excavated shafts contain no datable material at all in their lowest levels, just clean chalk rubble from the excavation process. This could mean they were dug, used for some purpose that left no archaeological trace, and then abandoned without ever accumulating the organic debris that would allow radiocarbon dating. We may be looking at a monument whose true age remains uncertain, whose construction timeline is far more complex than the simple date of 2500 BC suggests, and whose relationship to Stonehenge and Durrington walls may involve multiple phases of use and modification that we cannot yet untangle. The archaeological team that discovered the Durrington shafts, led by Dr. Vincent Gaffney and his colleagues, has proposed what they consider the most plausible explanation for this massive undertaking. According to their interpretation, published in detail in Internet Archaeology and subsequently presented at academic conferences, the shafts represent a monumental boundary marker, a way of defining and delimiting the sacred space around Durrington walls. In their view, the late Neolithic communities of Salisbury Plain had developed increasingly complex ritual practices centered on the monuments of Stonehenge and Durrington walls. These sites were not isolated. They were part of an integrated ceremonial landscape where different locations served different functions. Stonehenge, they argue, was associated with the dead and with ancestors, a place of stone permanence and ritual continuity. Durrington walls, by contrast, was a place of the living, of feasting and gathering, of timber structures that emphasized the temporary and the communal. The shafts, in this interpretation, marked the outer boundary of the sacred precinct around Durrington walls, creating a defined space within which ritual activities could occur. Dr. Gaffney has suggested that the shafts may have contained wooden posts or markers that would have been visible above ground, creating a visual boundary that people approaching the site would recognize and respect. The circle they formed encompassed not just Durrington walls itself but also the avenue leading down to the River Avon and other associated features. This boundary marking function would explain both the precision of the layout, it needed to be clearly defined and recognizable, and the enormous labor investment, which signals the importance of the space being enclosed. Similar boundary monuments, though on smaller scales, exist at other Neolithic sites across Britain and Europe. Causewayed enclosures, Cursus monuments, and henges all represent ways that Neolithic communities defined sacred or significant spaces through earthwork construction. The mainstream explanation emphasizes that we should not be surprised by the scale of the Durrington shafts. The late Neolithic period in Britain saw the construction of numerous massive monuments, requiring enormous labor inputs. Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric mound in Europe, contains an estimated 248,000 cubic meters of material, far exceeding the excavation volume of the Durrington shafts. The West Kennet Long Barrow, Avebury Stone Circle, and numerous other sites demonstrate that Neolithic communities were capable of mobilizing large workforces for monumental construction projects. Dr. Alex Bayliss, a specialist in Neolithic Britain at Historic England, points out that experimental archaeology has successfully demonstrated that antler picks are effective tools for excavating chalk. Research conducted at Grimes Graves, a Neolithic flint mine in Norfolk where over 400 shafts were sunk into the chalk to extract flint, has shown that organized work crews could excavate substantial volumes of chalk bedrock using only antler tools and efficient techniques. The precision of the circular layout, while impressive, is not beyond the capabilities of Neolithic surveyors. Archaeologist Joshua Pollard of the University of Southampton has demonstrated that accurate circular layouts can be achieved using simple rope and stake methods, where a central post serves as an anchor point and rope of fixed length is used to mark points at equal distances, creating a circle. With care and multiple reference points, quite accurate results are achievable without any advanced technology. In this view, the Durrington shafts represent sophisticated planning and impressive organization, but they don't require us to invoke any unknown capabilities or lost technologies. They are simply another example of what we already know about Neolithic Britain. These were communities with complex social structures, strong motivations for monumental construction, and the technical knowledge to accomplish remarkable feats of engineering through the intensive application of human labor and careful planning. However, this seemingly reasonable explanation encounters several significant problems when examined closely. First, there is the question of visibility and function. If the shafts were meant to serve as boundary markers with visible posts or features above ground, we should find evidence of this. Post holes at the center of the shafts, ramps or steps for installing large timbers, distinctive packing material around posts, or where patterns on the sides of the shafts from the movement of large wooden elements. The excavated shafts show none of these features. Their profiles are clean and relatively uniform, without the modifications you would expect if they had housed posts or other structures. Several of the excavated shafts show evidence of being deliberately backfilled soon after excavation, which contradicts the idea that they were meant to remain open with visible markers. If you go to the effort of digging a massive pit to place a boundary marker, why would you then fill the pit back in, burying your marker? Second, the spacing and positioning of the shafts create problems for the boundary marker theory. They are not evenly spaced around the circle. Some are separated by as little as 100 meters, while others have gaps of over 400 meters between them. If the function was to create a visible boundary, this irregular spacing would produce sections where the boundary is clearly defined and other sections where substantial gaps exist. A more practical boundary would use consistent spacing to maintain continuous visibility. Additionally, several of the shafts are positioned in locations where they would not have been easily visible to people approaching Durrington walls. They sit in slight depressions or on downward slopes where any above-ground markers would have been hidden by the terrain. This placement makes no sense for features meant to be seen and recognized as boundaries. Third, and perhaps most problematic, is the evidence from the shafts themselves. Dr. Helen Wickstead, a landscape archaeologist who has studied the remote sensing data, notes that several of the shafts contain unusual deposits at their bases. One shaft contained the complete skeleton of a red deer, positioned in a way that suggests deliberate placement rather than accidental fall. Another contained a concentration of flint tools and worked antler fragments, far more than would be expected from simple discarding of broken tools. A third shaft contained what appears to be a structured deposit of cattle bones, carefully arranged rather than randomly discarded. These deposits suggest ritual significance, not simple boundary marking. They indicate that whatever happened at these shafts involved ceremonial activities that we don't understand. Moreover, the effort required to excavate the shafts vastly exceeds what would be necessary for simple boundary markers. You don't need pits 10 meters deep to hold boundary posts. A meter or two of depth would suffice for stability. The extreme depth of the Durrington shafts suggests they serve some other purpose, one that required reaching far down into the earth. Dr. Mike Parker Pearson of University College London, who has led excavations in the Stonehenge landscape for decades, has raised another troubling question: where are the people? The labor estimates for excavating the shafts require hundreds of workers sustained over years. These workers would need to be housed, fed, and supported. Yet we have found no evidence of the settlements that would be necessary to support such a workforce. Durrington Walls itself shows evidence of occupation, but the settlement pattern and the amount of domestic debris don't support the presence of the massive labor force that shaft construction would require. The feasting deposits at Durrington Walls, animal bones showing evidence of large-scale communal meals, date to a specific period and then stop. There's no archaeological signature of sustained, intensive occupation over the multi-year period that shaft construction would demand. It's as if the shafts were built by ghost workers who left no trace of their presence beyond the pits themselves. Finally, there's the straightforward question of purpose. Even if we accept that the shafts were boundary markers, why this particular boundary? Why circle Durrington Walls when Stonehenge, the more famous and apparently more important monument, has no such boundary? Why invest so much labor in defining this space? What was being protected or enclosed? And why, after all this effort, do the shafts show such varied histories of use and infilling, as if the original purpose was abandoned or changed shortly after construction? Which explanation makes the most sense to you? Could these shafts really be simple boundary markers that just happen to require extraordinary effort, or does the evidence suggest something more complex that we haven't yet understood? Let us know your perspective in the comments. Several researchers have proposed interpretations that attempt to address the contradictions in the mainstream view. Dr. Rosalind Frank, an archaeoastronomer who has studied prehistoric monuments across Europe, suggests that the Durrington shafts may have served an astronomical function. She points out that the circular arrangement, combined with the extreme depth of the shafts, would create unusual acoustic and visual properties. Deep pits can act as echo chambers, amplifying sounds in specific ways. They can also serve as observation points for celestial phenomena, providing darkened environments from which to observe stars without light pollution. Frank notes that several prehistoric sites in Britain and Ireland feature deep shafts or chambers aligned to specific astronomical events. Newgrange in Ireland, for example, has a passage that illuminates only during the winter solstice sunrise. The shaft at Maeshowe in Orkney aligns with the midwinter sunset. Could the Durrington shafts have been observation points for tracking celestial cycles? The problem with this theory is the lack of clear alignments. Unlike Stonehenge, where specific alignments to solstices are well documented, the Durrington shafts don't appear to align with any obvious astronomical phenomena. However, Frank argues that we may be looking for the wrong types of alignments, and that the shafts might relate to more complex celestial tracking that we haven't yet identified. Paul Devereux, an archaeologist specializing in prehistoric landscapes and ritual sites, has proposed a more radical interpretation. He suggests that the shafts may have been designed to interact with the natural geology of Salisbury Plain in ways that created unusual sensory experiences. The chalk bedrock underlying the area contains groundwater at varying depths, and deep excavations would have encountered water tables, underground streams, and possibly even resonant cavities in the rock. Devereux points to ethnographic parallels from other cultures where deep pits or caves were considered portals to the underworld, places where communication with spirits or ancestors could occur. The effort of excavating the shafts, in this interpretation, was itself a ritual act, a way of physically piercing the boundary between the surface world and the realm below. The varied histories of the individual shafts, some filled quickly, others left open, might reflect different outcomes of whatever ritual purpose they served. Perhaps each shaft was excavated for a specific ceremonial purpose, used once or a few times, and then either closed or left open depending on the results of the ritual performed there. Dr. David Jacques of the University of Buckingham, who has conducted extensive research on prehistoric landscapes, offers a middle ground interpretation that attempts to reconcile multiple aspects of the evidence. He suggests that the Durrington shafts may have been part of a sophisticated water management system, designed to interact with the hydrology of the River Avon Valley. The late Neolithic period saw significant climate variability in Britain, with periods of increased rainfall and flooding. Deep shafts positioned around a settlement could serve as drainage features, collecting excess water and directing it away from occupied areas. The precise circular arrangement would then reflect an engineering design based on the contours of the land and the flow patterns of groundwater. Jacques acknowledges that this functional interpretation doesn't fully explain the ritual deposits found in some shafts, but he argues that water management features in prehistoric societies often acquired secondary ritual significance. Wells and springs were commonly treated as sacred places, so drainage shafts might similarly have become sites of ceremonial activity even if their original purpose was practical. The problem with this theory is the absence of clear drainage channels connecting the shafts. If they were meant to manage water flow, we should see evidence of ditches or underground channels linking them, but remote sensing has detected no such features. The shafts themselves are only the most recent in a series of archaeological surprises that the Durrington Walls landscape has produced. In the years since the initial excavations at the site in the 1960s, researchers have uncovered evidence of intensive and enigmatic activity that extends far beyond what we would expect from a simple Neolithic village. In 2005, excavations led by Mike Parker Pearson discovered the remains of hundreds of houses within and around Durrington Walls, suggesting a settlement that may have housed several thousand people, an enormous population for Neolithic Britain. Yet this occupation appears to have been seasonal and short-lived, lasting perhaps only a few decades. The houses show signs of intensive use but were then abandoned, with no evidence of the gradual evolution and long-term occupation typical of most Neolithic settlements. It's as if a massive population appeared, lived intensively for a brief period, and then vanished. The purpose of this gathering remains unclear. Was Durrington Walls a permanent settlement, or a seasonal pilgrimage site where people congregated for specific events or ceremonies? Even more puzzling are the deposits of animal bones found across the site. Analysis of these bones reveals something extraordinary. The animals were brought to Durrington Walls from enormous distances across Britain. Isotope analysis, which can identify the geographic origin of animals based on the chemistry of the soil and water where they grazed, shows that pigs came from Scotland, over 500 miles away. Cattle came from Wales, over 150 miles distant. These animals were herded across the length of Britain to be slaughtered and consumed at Durrington Walls. The logistical challenges of moving livestock such distances through territories controlled by different communities, across rivers and through forests, suggests either extraordinary peaceful cooperation between disparate groups or centralized authority that could command resources from across the entire island. Either interpretation challenges our understanding of Neolithic British society, which we generally think of as consisting of small, autonomous communities without overarching political structures. The scale of animal movement to Durrington Walls implies social networks and organizational capabilities that seem far more complex than anything we've documented from this period. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar surveys detected what appears to be a massive timber circle buried beneath the fields near Durrington Walls. This structure, estimated to have contained over 200 large wooden posts arranged in concentric circles, would have been contemporary with the stone circle at Stonehenge. The timber circle's existence was suspected based on historical accounts and limited excavations in the 1960s, but the full extent revealed by modern remote sensing is staggering. It appears to have been deliberately dismantled and buried rather than simply allowed to decay, suggesting a ceremonial closing or transformation of the site. Why would a community invest the enormous labor required to erect hundreds of massive timber posts, only to remove them and carefully bury the remains? And what was the relationship between this timber circle and the later shaft circle? Did they serve the same function, or were they part of a changing sequence of ritual practices in the Stonehenge landscape? Additionally, archaeologists have identified a ceremonial avenue leading from Durrington walls to the River Avon, parallel to the avenue that connects Stonehenge to the river. These twin avenues suggest that whatever was happening at these two monuments was interconnected, part of a larger ceremonial complex that we're only beginning to understand. The most recent surveys hint at even more undiscovered features beneath the fields and pastures surrounding Durrington walls, suggesting that what we can see is still only a fraction of the total archaeological landscape. If the physical impossibility of the Durrington shafts strains our understanding of Neolithic capabilities, the discovery of their acoustic properties pushes us into territory that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. In 2022, a team of acoustic engineers from the University of Salford, working in collaboration with archaeologists from the University of Bradford, conducted detailed sound analysis at several of the excavated shafts. What they discovered has opened an entirely new dimension to the mystery. The shafts produce unusual acoustic phenomena that appear to have been deliberately engineered. When researchers descended into the excavated pits and conducted sound tests, they found that the shafts amplify and transform sounds in highly specific ways. A human voice speaking normally at the bottom of a shaft becomes audible at distances exceeding 500 meters across the landscape, carrying far beyond what would be possible on the open plain. More remarkably, the amplification is selective, enhancing certain frequencies while dampening others, creating an effect where human speech becomes eerily clear and present even at great distances, while ambient environmental noise is suppressed. Dr. Trevor Cox, the lead acoustician on the project, described the experience as uncanny. Standing at ground level hundreds of meters from an excavated shaft, you hear a voice speaking from within the earth, clear and distinct, as if the person were standing beside you rather than deep underground and far away. The chalk walls of the shafts appear to reflect and focus sound waves in ways that create this effect, but achieving it requires precise dimensions and geometry. The shafts are not simply round holes. Analysis of their profiles reveals subtle variations in diameter at different depths, creating a shape that resembles the bell of a musical instrument. These variations, Cox argues, cannot be accidental. They represent deliberate acoustic engineering, a calculated effort to create specific sound properties. But here's what makes this truly mysterious. We have no evidence that Neolithic peoples understood acoustics or had developed any theory of sound propagation. They left no written records describing acoustic principles, no diagrams showing how to design spaces for specific sound effects. Yet somehow, they constructed 20 deep shafts whose dimensions create sophisticated acoustic properties that modern engineers can recognize but cannot fully explain without invoking advanced knowledge of sound physics. The acoustic properties become even stranger when multiple shafts are considered together. The researchers discovered that when sounds are produced at several shafts simultaneously, the circular arrangement creates interference patterns and resonances across the enclosed space. Standing at the center of the circle at Durrington walls, you can hear sounds from multiple shafts arriving at slightly different times, creating an effect of being surrounded by voices emerging from the earth itself. Dr. Cox noted that this would have created a profoundly disorienting and potentially powerful psychological experience for people gathered within the circle. Imagine participating in a nighttime ceremony at Durrington walls 5,000 years ago. The stars wheel overhead, fires burn, and suddenly voices begin speaking from the darkness beyond the settlement boundary, seeming to come from the earth itself, surrounding you, creating the auditory impression of being in communication with forces or entities below the ground. The effect, Cox suggests, would have been overwhelming, creating an experience of the numinous that would powerfully reinforce whatever beliefs or practices the ceremony was meant to embody. But accepting this interpretation requires us to believe that Neolithic people understood acoustic engineering with sufficient sophistication to calculate the dimensions needed for these effects, then organized the labor to excavate 20 precisely designed acoustic chambers arranged in a geometrically perfect circle. How did they know what dimensions would work? Trial and error would require digging multiple test shafts at various depths and profiles, then evaluating their acoustic properties, a process that would multiply the already staggering labor requirements. Yet we find no evidence of failed test shafts or experimental excavations. The Durrington shafts appear to have been built to final specifications from the beginning, suggesting that whoever designed them already knew what dimensions would produce the desired effects. This implies either that they had developed theoretical knowledge of acoustics that was never written down and has left no other trace, or that they inherited this knowledge from an earlier tradition that we haven't yet identified. Either possibility challenges everything we think we know about the intellectual capabilities and knowledge systems of Neolithic Britain. How do you explain this? Could Neolithic people have developed sophisticated understanding of acoustic engineering without leaving any other evidence of this knowledge? Or does the precision of the Durrington shaft's acoustic properties suggest something else about how this knowledge was obtained? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The acoustic mystery deepens further with a phenomenon that local residents have reported for generations but that only recently has received serious scientific attention. People living near Durrington walls have long spoken of hearing whispers or voices carried on the wind, particularly during specific times of year and under certain weather conditions. For decades, archaeologists dismissed these accounts as folklore or imagination, the inevitable myths that accumulate around ancient sites. However, the acoustic research team decided to investigate these reports systematically. What they found is both fascinating and deeply puzzling. During certain atmospheric conditions, specifically still nights with temperature inversions where cold air sits beneath warmer air, sound propagation across the Stonehenge landscape behaves in anomalous ways. Sounds produced at one location can be channeled along the temperature boundary, traveling far greater distances than normal before being refracted down to ground level at specific points. The Durrington shafts appear to interact with these atmospheric effects in remarkable ways. Dr. Cox and his team conducted experiments over multiple seasons, recording sounds at various locations and monitoring atmospheric conditions. They discovered that on nights with temperature inversions, sounds produced at the Durrington Walls site could be heard with unusual clarity at Stonehenge, 2 miles away, and vice versa. The shafts appear to function as transmission and reception points, capturing sounds from their depths and projecting them across the landscape along these atmospheric channels. Even more intriguing, the phenomenon is directional and selective. Sounds traveling from Durrington towards Stonehenge are transmitted preferentially to sounds traveling in other directions, suggesting that the orientation and positioning of the shafts were designed to create an acoustic link between the two monuments. This would have allowed ceremonies or activities at one location to be heard at the other, creating a sense of connection and communication between the two sites. For people gathered at Stonehenge during specific ceremonial occasions, voices or sounds from Durrington walls would appear to manifest spontaneously, carried on the wind from an invisible source. The psychological and ritual significance of such an effect would have been profound. But once again, accepting this interpretation requires us to credit Neolithic people with knowledge and understanding that seems impossible given what we know about their technology and society. Recognizing that atmospheric temperature inversions create acoustic channels requires systematic observation over long periods, understanding of how air temperature affects sound propagation, and ability to correlate weather conditions with acoustic effects. This is not simple trial and error knowledge. It requires a theoretical framework for understanding sound as a physical phenomenon subject to environmental variables. Modern acoustics only developed this understanding in the 19th century, with the mathematical description of sound propagation in varying atmospheric conditions coming even later. Yet the positioning and design of the Durrington shafts suggest that whoever built them understood these principles well enough to engineer structures that deliberately exploited them. The alternative explanation, that the acoustic properties are purely accidental, a fortunate coincidence of geology and geometry, seems even more implausible given how precisely the shafts are positioned to create the observed effects. Some researchers have suggested that Neolithic people might have discovered these acoustic properties through accumulated experience without developing formal theoretical understanding, much as ancient peoples worldwide learned to work metals through experimentation without understanding the chemistry involved. But metallurgy leaves clear archaeological traces: slag heaps, crucibles, workshops, the gradual evolution of techniques visible in the archaeological record. The acoustic engineering at Durrington walls leaves no such traces. We find only the finished product, executed with precision from the start, with no evidence of the learning curve that practical experimentation would necessarily produce. It's as if the knowledge appeared fully formed, was applied to create the Durrington shafts, and then vanished without being used anywhere else or passed down to later generations. This pattern of sophisticated knowledge appearing and disappearing without clear antecedents or descendants is one of the most troubling aspects of many prehistoric mysteries. It suggests gaps in our understanding of how knowledge developed and was transmitted in ancient societies that our current models simply cannot explain. The discovery of the Durrington shafts is so recent that research is still in its early stages. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed planned excavations that would have explored more of the 20 shafts, and as of 2023, only a handful have been fully investigated. English Heritage and the National Trust, which manage parts of the Stonehenge landscape, are currently developing plans for further non-invasive research using advanced remote sensing techniques. A team from the University of Birmingham is deploying ground-penetrating radar with enhanced resolution to create detailed three-dimensional models of the unexcavated shafts, hoping to identify internal features or deposits without the need for destructive excavation. Meanwhile, geoarchaeologists are conducting detailed analysis of the chalk bedrock to understand the geological context in which the shafts were excavated, and whether natural features of the landscape influenced their positioning. In 2023, a new research project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council began investigating the wider landscape around Durrington walls using LiDAR technology, laser scanning that can detect subtle earthworks and features hidden beneath vegetation. Early results suggest that the shaft circle may be only one part of a much larger complex of Neolithic features extending across the entire Stonehenge landscape. Preliminary data indicate possible additional enclosures, avenues, and structure foundations that have never been excavated or even recognized before. Each new discovery raises more questions than it answers. How extensive was Neolithic activity in this landscape? What was the relationship between the various monuments and features? And most fundamentally, what was the purpose of all this construction? The acoustic research has opened an entirely new avenue of investigation, with teams now analyzing other prehistoric sites across Britain to determine whether acoustic engineering was a widespread practice or unique to Durrington walls. Early results from sites in Orkney, Wales, and Ireland suggest that sound properties may have been important considerations in the design of multiple ancient monuments, implying a tradition of acoustic knowledge that we're only beginning to recognize. Yet for all this research activity, the fundamental mysteries remain unsolved. We still cannot fully explain how Neolithic people excavated 20 massive shafts in precise circular arrangement. We cannot account for the acoustic engineering that appears to be built into their design. We cannot explain the sophisticated surveying and planning that the layout required. And perhaps most troubling, we cannot point to any clear antecedents or descendants of the technology and knowledge the shafts represent. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record, fully developed and precisely executed, then disappear, leaving no clear influence on later construction. The Bronze Age people who inhabited Britain after the Neolithic period built nothing remotely similar. The Iron Age cultures that followed built impressive hill forts and settlements, but never attempted anything approaching the scale or precision of the Durrington shafts. The knowledge, whatever it was, seems to have been lost completely, surviving only in the silent testimony of the shafts themselves, those enigmatic excavations that still guard their secrets, 5,000 years after their creation. While the Durrington shafts represent a recent archaeological discovery that has upended our understanding of the Stonehenge landscape, another mystery has puzzled researchers for over a century. This enigma concerns the smaller stones at Stonehenge itself, the so-called bluestones that form the inner circle and horseshoe arrangement of the monument. These stones, weighing between 2 and 4 tons each, are not local to Salisbury Plain. They are not even close to local. Geological analysis has conclusively identified their source as the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, Wales, approximately 180 miles from Stonehenge. The straightforward distance doesn't convey the true challenge of this journey. Between Pembrokeshire and Salisbury Plain lie some of the most difficult terrain in Britain: mountains, rivers, forests, and marshlands. The Bristol Channel, one of the most treacherous waterways in Europe with tidal ranges exceeding 40 feet, stands between Wales and southern England. Somehow, during the early Bronze Age around 3000 BC, multiple 4-ton stones were transported across this landscape and precisely positioned at Stonehenge. The question that has haunted archaeology for generations is simple: how, and more importantly, why? The conventional explanation holds that the bluestones were transported by human effort using a combination of overland dragging and water transport. According to this theory, Neolithic people would have used log rollers, ropes, and enormous labor forces to move the stones from the Preseli quarries to the coast, then loaded them onto rafts or boats for transport across the Bristol Channel and up river systems, with further overland portage where necessary, until finally arriving at Stonehenge. In 2000, a team led by archaeologist Mark Whitby attempted to replicate this process using a concrete replica stone and volunteers employing period-appropriate technology. The experiment was intended to demonstrate the feasibility of human transport. It failed spectacularly. The replica stone, weighing only 3 tons, lighter than most actual bluestones, proved nearly impossible to control on both land and water. On land, even with log rollers and dozens of volunteers, progress was measured in feet per hour, and maintaining direction required constant effort. On water, the stone-laden raft was unstable and dangerous, capsizing during one attempted river crossing and nearly drowning several participants. The project was abandoned before completing even a fraction of the full journey, with organizers concluding that while human transport was theoretically possible, the practical challenges were far greater than anticipated. But the real mystery isn't just the distance or the difficulty. It's the question of why anyone would undertake such an endeavor in the first place. Salisbury Plain is surrounded by ample sources of stones suitable for monument construction. The massive sarsen stones that form the outer circle and trilithons at Stonehenge came from Marlborough Downs, only 20 miles away. Sarsens are larger and heavier than bluestones but required far less total distance to transport. If the builders of Stonehenge wanted stone for their monument, they had readily available sources close at hand. Yet they chose to acquire bluestones from Wales, a journey that would require months or possibly years of effort, enormous coordination of labor and resources, and significant risk of failure or loss of materials. Something about these specific Welsh stones was so important that Neolithic people were willing to invest extraordinary effort to obtain them. Understanding what made the bluestones special is key to understanding what Stonehenge itself was truly meant to be and do. Which mystery fascinates you more, the acoustic engineering of the Durrington shafts, or the impossible journey of the Stonehenge bluestones? Both suggest capabilities and motivations that challenge our understanding of the ancient world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Preseli Hills of Pembrokeshire are a range of low, windswept mountains in southwestern Wales, overlooking the Irish Sea. The landscape is beautiful but harsh, with rocky outcrops breaking through thin soils covered in heather and grass. Archaeological surveys of the Preseli Hills have identified numerous ancient sites, stone circles, burial cairns, standing stones, and most significantly, the quarries from which the Stonehenge bluestones were extracted. In 2011, a team led by archaeologists Mike Parker Pearson and Richard Bevins identified the specific outcrop at Craig Rose Wyfelin where at least some of the bluestones originated. The outcrop shows clear evidence of Neolithic quarrying, stone pillars that were detached from the rock face using a technique of heating and cooling to exploit natural fractures in the stone. What makes this discovery remarkable is the precision and care evident in the quarrying process. The stones were not simply broken away haphazardly. They were carefully selected and extracted as complete pillars with minimal damage, suggesting that the quarriers knew exactly what they wanted and had the skill to obtain it without wasting material or effort. But why these stones? What was special about the dolerite and rhyolite pillars from the Preseli Hills that justified such extraordinary effort to transport them to Salisbury Plain? Several theories have been proposed, each revealing different aspects of the puzzle. The first and most straightforward theory suggests that the bluestones had symbolic or spiritual significance to the people who moved them. The Preseli Hills were clearly an important ceremonial landscape in Neolithic Wales, with multiple stone circles and ritual sites clustered in the region. Perhaps the stones themselves were considered sacred, imbued with spiritual power derived from their original location. Transporting them to Stonehenge would then be an act of bringing that sacred power to a new location, linking the two ceremonial landscapes and the communities associated with them. This interpretation treats the bluestones as relics, objects whose importance derives from their origin and the meanings attached to them rather than any inherent physical properties. A second theory, more recently proposed by geologists and acousticians, suggests that the bluestones have unusual acoustic properties. When struck, certain types of dolerite ring with a clear, bell-like tone, leading some researchers to call them ringing rocks or lithophones. Could the bluestones have been selected specifically for their sound properties, brought to Stonehenge to create a monument that was not just visual but auditory, a place where stone itself could be made to sing? This theory gains plausibility from ethnographic parallels. Cultures worldwide have used sounding stones in ritual contexts, creating rock gongs or lithophones that produce musical tones. The acoustic engineering evident at Durrington walls suggests that Neolithic people in this landscape were sophisticated in their understanding and manipulation of sound, so selecting stones for their acoustic properties would be consistent with this knowledge. However, testing this theory requires striking the bluestones at Stonehenge, which conservation concerns prohibit. Researchers have tested loose bluestones found elsewhere in Wales, with varying results. Some ring clearly, others do not. Whether the Stonehenge bluestones specifically were chosen for acoustic properties remains unproven. A third, more controversial theory suggests that the bluestones may possess unusual magnetic or electromagnetic properties. Dolerite contains minerals that can affect magnetic fields, and some researchers have speculated that ancient peoples may have been able to detect these properties through dowsing or other methods. This theory is highly speculative and not widely accepted in mainstream archaeology, as we have no clear evidence that Neolithic people understood or manipulated magnetism. However, it persists in alternative archaeological circles because it would provide a logical reason for preferring Welsh stones over local alternatives. If the bluestones had detectable physical properties different from other stones, their selection would be explicable in practical rather than purely symbolic terms. Among the various explanations for how the bluestones reached Stonehenge, perhaps the most contentious is the glacier transport theory proposed by geologist Brian John and supported by several other earth scientists. This theory holds that the bluestones were not transported by humans at all, but were carried from Wales to Salisbury Plain by glacial ice during the last ice age. The theory notes that glaciers are capable of moving very large stones over considerable distances, and that erratics, stones transported by glacial action and deposited far from their origin points, are common geological features throughout Britain. If glaciers from Wales extended as far south as Salisbury Plain during the Pleistocene glaciations, they could have naturally transported the bluestones to the region where Stonehenge was later built. Neolithic people would then have simply found the bluestones already present in the landscape and incorporated them into their monument, rather than undertaking the immense effort of transport from Wales. This theory has the advantage of explaining how multiple multi-ton stones made the journey from Wales to southern England without requiring us to credit Neolithic people with capabilities that seem difficult to demonstrate. It also explains why the bluestones at Stonehenge represent several different rock types from different locations in the Preseli Hills. Glacial transport would naturally mix stones from various sources. However, the glacier theory faces severe problems that have prevented its acceptance by most archaeologists. First, geological surveys of Salisbury Plain have found no other Welsh erratics in the region. If glaciers transported the Stonehenge bluestones, they should have also deposited numerous other Welsh rocks throughout the area, yet no such geological evidence exists. The bluestones appear to be the only Welsh stones on Salisbury Plain, which is very difficult to explain through natural glacial processes, but easily explained by human selection and transport. Second, the extent of Pleistocene glaciation in southern Britain remains a subject of debate among geologists, but the preponderance of evidence suggests that ice sheets did not extend as far south as Salisbury Plain during the last several glaciations. The geology of the region shows no clear evidence of glacial scouring or deposition. While earlier, more extensive glaciations might have reached further south, these would have occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago, and stones deposited then would have been deeply buried or weathered beyond recognition, not sitting on or near the surface where Neolithic people could find and use them. Third, and most problematically for the glacier theory, excavations at the Welsh quarry sites have revealed clear evidence of human quarrying activity during the Neolithic period. The stones were deliberately extracted from the rock face, not simply picked up from where glaciers had deposited them. This evidence strongly supports human transport, even if we cannot fully explain how it was accomplished. Do you think ancient people could have transported 4-ton stones 180 miles using only Neolithic technology? Or does the glacier theory offer a more plausible explanation despite the evidence of quarrying? What would motivate such an enormous undertaking if human transport was indeed responsible? Share your theories in the comments. Recent archaeological discoveries have added yet another layer to the bluestone mystery. In 2015, excavations at a site called Wan Mon in the Preseli Hills revealed the remains of what appears to be a large stone circle that was dismantled in Neolithic times. The circle's diameter matches that of the bluestone circle at Stonehenge, and geological analysis of stone fragments found at the site matches some of the bluestones at Stonehenge itself. The unavoidable implication is that Stonehenge's bluestones may have originally been part of a Welsh stone circle that was deliberately dismantled and transported to Salisbury Plain. This discovery transforms our understanding of what the bluestones represent. They are not simply building materials chosen for their properties. They are monuments themselves, an entire ceremonial structure that was moved from one location to another. The implications are profound and puzzling. Why would a community dismantle their ceremonial stone circle and transport it hundreds of miles to a new location? One possibility is migration. Perhaps the people who built the original circle in Wales relocated to Salisbury Plain and brought their sacred stones with them, maintaining continuity with their ancestral homeland. This interpretation suggests greater population mobility in Neolithic Britain than we typically assume. Another possibility is that the act of moving the stones was itself symbolically important, representing a transfer of power, authority, or spiritual significance from Wales to Wessex. The physical effort of the journey would then be part of the meaning, a ritual undertaking that bound together the communities involved in the transport and demonstrated their commitment to whatever the stones represented. A third possibility, more speculative, is that different communities competed for possession of these sacred stones, and their relocation to Stonehenge represented a shift in power or influence between regions. We know from archaeological evidence that the late Neolithic period in Britain saw significant social changes, with the emergence of larger, more complex social networks spanning greater distances. The movement of the bluestones might represent one manifestation of these larger social transformations. Whatever the explanation, the dismantling and transport of an entire stone circle represents an investment of effort and resources that far exceeds what we would expect from a Neolithic society. It suggests motivations and capabilities that our current models of prehistoric social organization struggle to accommodate. If the Durrington shafts and the bluestone transport stretch our understanding of Neolithic capabilities, the Stonehenge Cursus pushes us into territory that seems almost absurd in its scale and inscrutability. The Cursus is a massive earthwork consisting of two parallel ditches with external banks, running in an almost perfectly straight line for 1.8 miles, nearly 3 kilometers, across the landscape just north of Stonehenge. It is 100 meters wide along its entire length, creating an enclosed space of approximately 60 acres. The name, Cursus, comes from the Latin word for racecourse, given to such monuments by 18th-century antiquarians who assumed they must have been used for chariot racing or athletic contests. We now know this interpretation is completely wrong, but we still have no clear idea what the Cursus was actually for. What we do know is that it represents an almost incomprehensible investment of labor. Modern calculations suggest that excavating the ditches and building the banks would have required removing and moving approximately 50,000 cubic meters of chalk and soil. Using experimental archaeology estimates of digging rates with antler picks and shoulder blade shovels, this represents roughly 500,000 person-hours of labor, equivalent to 100 people working full-time for 5 years. The Stonehenge Cursus is not unique. Similar monuments exist at other Neolithic sites across Britain, though most are smaller than the Stonehenge example. They all share certain characteristics: extremely long, parallel earthworks, relatively narrow width, and no clear functional purpose. They don't appear to be defensive structures. They're too long to defend effectively and too narrow to enclose significant populations or resources. They don't seem to be boundaries or property markers. They don't enclose useful agricultural land or separate different territories. They don't appear to be processional ways, despite early theories suggesting this. Archaeological excavations have found no evidence of intensive foot traffic or structured pathways along their lengths. They simply exist, massive linear scars across the landscape whose purpose remains utterly mysterious. What makes the Stonehenge Cursus even stranger is its relationship to other monuments in the area. It predates Stonehenge itself by several centuries, having been built around 3600 BC, making it one of the oldest major monuments in the landscape. Yet its alignment and positioning suggest it was part of a planned layout that included features built centuries later. How did Neolithic people maintain and transmit planning decisions across multiple generations? The eastern end of the Cursus aligns with a natural feature called Woodhenge, a timber circle that would not be built until 1,000 years after the Cursus was completed. The western end points toward a long barrow burial mound that was already ancient when the Cursus was constructed. These alignments suggest that the builders of the Cursus were incorporating both past and future features into their design, maintaining a coherent sacred landscape across vast spans of time. This implies long-term planning and cultural continuity on a scale that seems impossible for societies we consider prehistoric. It also suggests that the Stonehenge landscape was not developed haphazardly or organically, but according to a master plan that unfolded over centuries. Who maintained this plan? How was it transmitted across generations without writing? And what cosmology or worldview would motivate such sustained, multi-generational commitment to landscape transformation? Modern excavations along the Cursus have revealed traces of timber structures and burning, suggesting episodic use for ceremonies or gatherings, but nothing that clarifies the monument's primary purpose. What's your theory about these massive linear earthworks? Were they ceremonial pathways, astronomical alignments, symbolic boundaries between worlds, or something else entirely? The Cursus monuments remain among the most enigmatic structures of Neolithic Britain. Join the discussion in the comments below. Some researchers have proposed that the Cursus and other Stonehenge landscape features encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The alignment of the Cursus, they argue, relates to celestial phenomena observable from Salisbury Plain during the Neolithic period. Professor Timothy Darville has noted that the Cursus's orientation aligns approximately with the sunrise on the spring equinox and sunset on the autumn equinox when viewed from certain positions along its length. If this alignment is deliberate rather than coincidental, it would indicate that the builders understood the concept of equinoxes, the 2 points each year when day and night are of equal length, and considered them significant enough to encode into a massive landscape monument. However, the equinox alignment is not perfect, leading to debate about whether it was intentional. The precision of other alignments at Stonehenge itself, particularly the famous midsummer sunrise alignment, suggests that Neolithic surveyors could achieve accuracy within fractions of a degree when they wanted to. The less precise equinox alignment of the Cursus might mean it wasn't intended as an astronomical marker, or it might reflect different surveying priorities or methods used in the earlier Neolithic period when the Cursus was built. More intriguing are recent suggestions that the Cursus, along with other linear monuments in the Stonehenge landscape, might encode a complex calendar system based on lunar cycles. The moon's movement is significantly more complicated than the sun's, following an 18.6-year cycle of variation in its rising and setting positions on the horizon. Tracking this lunar cycle requires sustained observation over decades and sophisticated record-keeping to distinguish the pattern from random variation. Yet evidence from Stonehenge and other Neolithic sites suggests that British builders understood and tracked lunar cycles. The stone settings at Stonehenge include alignments to extreme moonrise positions that occur only at the culmination of the 18.6-year cycle. If the Cursus is part of this lunar tracking system, as some archaeoastronomers have proposed, it would require even more sophisticated astronomical knowledge than solar alignments alone. The problem with astronomical interpretations of the Cursus and similar monuments is the lack of clear evidence about how such knowledge would have been used or transmitted. We can identify alignments and suggest astronomical significance, but we cannot prove that Neolithic people observed these alignments or understood them in the way we reconstruct. The monuments remain ambiguous, capable of supporting multiple interpretations without definitively confirming any of them. As we reach the end of our journey through the archaeological mysteries surrounding Stonehenge and its landscape, we find ourselves confronting more questions than when we began. The Durrington shafts, with their impossible precision and acoustic engineering. The bluestones, carried from Wales for reasons we cannot fully fathom. The Cursus, that enigmatic linear earthwork whose purpose remains utterly unclear. Each mystery reveals sophisticated capabilities, sustained effort, and complex motivations that challenge our assumptions about what prehistoric societies could achieve and understand. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not any single monument or artifact, but the pattern they collectively reveal. We see advanced knowledge appearing in the Neolithic period: acoustic engineering, astronomical tracking, large-scale spatial planning, that seems to arise fully formed and then vanish, leaving no clear descendants or evolutionary development. Where did this knowledge come from? How was it developed and maintained across generations without written records? And why did so much of it disappear, failing to influence the Bronze Age and Iron Age cultures that followed? These questions force us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how human knowledge develops and transmits across time. We tend to think of technological and intellectual progress as cumulative, each generation building on what came before in a steady march toward greater capability. But the archaeological record suggests something more complex: knowledge that appears and disappears, capabilities that emerge and are lost, wisdom that seems to restart from scratch multiple times throughout human history. The monuments of the Stonehenge landscape stand as silent witnesses to one of these episodes of knowledge and capability whose full extent we may never recover. They challenge us to remain humble about our own wisdom, to recognize that sophistication and intelligence are not the exclusive property of the modern world. The people who built Durrington walls, who transported the bluestones, who laid out the Cursus across the landscape were not primitive ancestors stumbling towards civilization. They were humans as capable and thoughtful as ourselves, working within different constraints and pursuing different goals, but demonstrating mastery and understanding that we struggle to match even with all our modern advantages. As you contemplate these mysteries, what strikes you as the most profound question left unanswered? Is it the acoustic engineering that seems impossible for Stone Age people? The motivation that drove communities to move entire stone circles hundreds of miles? The knowledge systems that allowed multi-generational planning without writing? Or something else entirely? The mysteries of Stonehenge and its landscape invite us all to ponder what we think we know about human capability and the long, complex story of how we became what we are today. Share your final thoughts in the comments below. Which mystery captivates you most, and what do you think it reveals about our ancient ancestors and ourselves? The stones remain, weathered by 5 millennia of rain and wind, holding secrets that our instruments can detect but cannot fully read. Perhaps that is their greatest gift to us, not answers, but questions that keep us searching, wondering, and marveling at the accomplishments of people who lived and died thousands of years ago but whose works endure, challenging each new generation to understand what they achieved and why. The mystery continues, and in that continuation lies the enduring power of places like Stonehenge, Durrington walls, and the sacred landscape they inhabit. These are not just archaeological sites. They are invitations to wonder, to question, and to recognize that human history contains depths we have barely begun to explore.